Beneath the veils of shadow and flame lies the tapestry of mortal ambition, a web I weave with threads of despair, greed, and folly. I am no phantom of idle fancy, but the whisperer in darkness, the architect of your undone salvation. Within these tales, I beckon you to walk alongside me, not as a friend, but as a voyeur to the ruin of 3 souls, each their own architect, each their own fool. Here, justice is not blind. I am not the monster they whisper about in trembling circles. I am merely the arbiter of human ambition, the mirror in which desperate souls glimpse their own grotesque reflections. Tonight, the stage is set. The contract, waiting to be inked, as another soul teeters on the edge of ruin, ready to leap into my embrace. Carson Wells was the sort of man who believed himself untouchable. A litigator of renown, his sharp tongue and sharper mind had won him accolades, fortune, and enemies in equal measure. But beneath his tailored suits and courtroom bravado, Carson bore a festering wound, a desperation to ascend the final rung of the professional ladder. To him, justice was a commodity, and truth a malleable substance to be twisted at his will. How delightfully ironic, then, that he would come to me seeking fairness in a world he'd corrupted. He found me in the smoke-filled corners of a private lounge, the sort of place where men like him drown their anxieties in aged whiskey and expensive lies. I wore no horns, no cloven hooves, only the guise of an unassuming gentleman, a man whose shadow seemed to stretch impossibly long against the dim light. "Mr. Wells," I greeted him, my voice a velvet caress. "I hear you've been looking for a solution to your predicament." He eyed me warily, though the greed in his heart betrayed him. "Who are you, and how do you know my name?" I smiled, a crescent moon of teeth. "Let us say I am an investor, and you, Mr. Wells, have caught my attention. You want success beyond measure, do you not? To never lose a case, to rise above your peers as a titan of law." His hesitation was brief. The flame of ambition burned too brightly to be snuffed by reason. "What's the cost?" he asked, as all mortals do. "I don't ask much, just to be repaid," I replied, savoring the way the word made him shiver. "Payable at the end of your illustrious career. Until then, you will have everything you desire: wealth, power, an unbroken streak in courtrooms." His laugh was brittle. "My soul? What is that worth, anyway?" Ah, the arrogance of men. Without further protest, he signed his name in blood, the ink of eternity, on a contract older than the stones of the earth. And so, the wheels of fate began to turn. True to my word, Carson's victories multiplied. No argument was too complex, no jury too skeptical. He dismantled opponents with ease, his name becoming legend among legal circles. The world adored him, and he relished its applause. Yet with every triumph, his humanity ebbed, replaced by an insatiable hunger for more. He defended the guilty with fervor, securing freedom for men whose hands dripped with blood. In private, he laughed at the folly of morality, at the gullibility of jurors swayed by his silver tongue. But success is a double-edged blade, and Carson's hubris ensured it would soon cut him down. The final chapter of his tale unfolded on a storm-lashed evening, the kind where lightning fractures the sky like a shattered mirror. Carson had just secured his most controversial victory, acquitting a billionaire accused of poisoning his rivals. The press hounded him as he exited the courthouse, their cameras flashing like the electric chaos above. Inside his mansion, he poured himself a celebratory drink. The amber liquid trembled in his glass as a sudden chill crept through the room. He turned, and there I stood, the veneer of civility stripped away. My eyes burned with an infernal glow, and my grin promised horrors untold. "It's time, Carson," I said, my voice echoing with the weight of millennia. "No," he screamed, stumbling back. "We had a deal. I'm not done yet." "Oh, but you are. Your career has reached its zenith, and the contract." He lunged at me, the desperation of a cornered animal fueling his attack. Foolish. With a wave of my hand, the room transformed into a grotesque courtroom, the walls adorned with the faces of those he'd wronged. They stared at him with hollow eyes, their mouths stretched into silent screams. Carson's cries for mercy were drowned by the cacophony of judgment. He found himself bound to his desk, the gavel in his hand burning like molten iron. "You'll not have me," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "On the contrary," I whispered, "I already do." The gavel fell, and with it, Carson's fate. The room erupted into flames, consuming him in a blaze that mirrored the fiery rhetoric he had once wielded. His screams echoed long after the flames died, leaving behind only ash and the faint scent of brimstone. And thus ended the story of Carson Wells, whose ambition outpaced his humanity. As I departed, I could not help but smile. 2 more souls awaited their turn, each as doomed as the last. After all, deals with the devil are seldom broken and never forgotten. There is no muse more potent than despair, no inspiration as intoxicating as desperation. Artists, of all mortals, wear their longing like a second skin, and Diane was no exception. Her canvas whispered of sleepless nights, of tears shed over unfinished dreams, and of a soul crumbling under the weight of obscurity. She wanted to be seen, to be adored, and most perilously, to be immortalized. So naturally, she found me. It was in a decrepit gallery, its walls adorned with the works of artists long dead, their genius appreciated only in the grave. Diane lingered there, her fingers brushing the edges of gilded frames, her eyes hollowed by envy and ambition. I approached her as I always do, in the guise of a fellow admirer. "A tragedy, isn't it?" I murmured, gesturing to a painting of a forlorn woman on a windswept moor. To create something so exquisite, only for it to gather dust in obscurity. She turned to me, startled but intrigued. "Are you an artist?" she asked. I chuckled, a low and resonant sound. "Not in the traditional sense, but I know talent when I see it, and you, Diane, have a spark that could set the art world ablaze." Her brow furrowed. "How do you know my name?" "Because I know what you want," I replied, leaning in so that my words brushed against her ear like a lover's caress. "Recognition? Fame? The kind of brilliance that outshines even death. I can give it to you, but only if you're willing to give me something in return." Her laugh was sharp, tinged with skepticism. "What could I possibly have that you'd want?" "Not much, just a small return on my investment," I said, savoring the way the color drained from her face. "In exchange, your work will captivate the world. Critics will weep before your exhibitions. Patrons will clamor for your pieces. You will be eternal." For a moment she hesitated, the weight of my words hanging in the stale air of the gallery. But her hunger was too great, her longing too insatiable. With trembling hands, she signed my contract, the ink glistening like spilled blood. The pact was sealed, and Diane's star began its meteoric rise. True to my promise, Diane's art had transformed overnight. Her once muted colors exploded into vivid brilliance, her abstract forms evoking emotions too complex for words. Her exhibitions became the stuff of legend, drawing crowds that snaked around city blocks. The world spoke her name with reverence, and she basked in its adoration. But the price of her genius was steep. Her dreams turned dark, haunted by faceless figures and shadowy whispers. Her hands, once steady, began to tremble, as if guided by forces beyond her control. She painted with feverish intensity, unable to stop even as her body withered and her mind frayed. Yet the world adored her, and that was enough. For a time. The final act of Diane's tale unfolded in her studio, a cavernous space filled with half-finished canvases and the stench of turpentine. She was alone, save for the flickering light of a single candle. Her latest masterpiece loomed before her, a grotesque and hypnotic swirl of color and despair. It was her magnum opus, and she knew it would be her last. When I arrived, she didn't flinch. She'd been expecting me. "It's done," she said, her voice a brittle whisper. "You've had your fun. Take what you came for." I stepped closer, the shadows bending toward me like supplicants. "Oh, Diane," I said, my tone mockingly tender. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, the world's greatest works are often born of tragedy, and yours will be no exception." Her eyes widened, panic blooming across her face. "Number you promised?" "I promised you immortality," I interrupted, my voice now a thunderclap. "And what is more immortal than the legacy of a tortured artist?" Before she could scream, the candle guttered out, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as her own paintings seemed to come alive. Figures emerged from the canvases, their faces twisted and eyeless, their hands clawing toward her. She stumbled back, her cries for help swallowed by the suffocating black. When the candle reignited, the studio was silent. Diane's body lay sprawled on the floor, her face frozen in an expression of terror. Around her, her paintings had transformed, their once beautiful forms now grotesque depictions of her final moments. The art world would hail them as her greatest works, their haunting brilliance ensuring her place in history. And as I departed, the faint scent of turpentine and despair lingered in the air, a testament to the cost of ambition. Diane had wanted to be immortal, and I had granted her wish, just not in the way she had imagined. Mortals often mistake ambition for destiny, and Fred was no exception, a car salesman of middling success. He prowled his dealership's showroom like a predator desperate for prey, his smile thin and his handshake slick with desperation. He had tasted mediocrity for too long and longed for a feast of triumph. His sales numbers dwindled, his commissions waned, and the whispers of termination grew louder by the day. It was then, at the precipice of failure, that I found him. He was seated in his office, a bottle of cheap whiskey his only company, when I arrived. My presence was announced not by sound, but by the subtle dimming of the overhead light, the shadows growing long and restless. "Rough day, Fred?" I asked, stepping into his line of sight. His eyes turned toward me, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" I smiled, a slow, predatory grin. "I'm here to help. I know you've been struggling, that you've been praying for a way to turn things around." Fred's face darkened, suspicion mingling with the faintest glimmer of hope. "What are you talking about?" "Success," I said, my voice a soothing purr. "The kind of success that makes legends out of men. I can make you the best car salesman this town, no, this country, has ever seen. but such rewards require a price. He laughed, though the sound was hollow. What price? Money? I don't have any. Not money, I said, leaning closer. Your soul. Fred's laughter died in his throat, his eyes narrowing. You're joking. Am I? I countered, producing a contract from the air. The parchment glowed faintly, the words etched in an ancient writhing script. Sign, and you'll have everything you've ever wanted. Refuse, and you'll be unemployed by the end of the month. He hesitated, the battle between reason and desperation playing out across his face. In the end, desperation won. With trembling hands, he took the pen I offered and signed his name. The ink bled crimson, the pact sealed. Fred's transformation was immediate. The very next day, he sold 5 cars before lunch, each transaction smoother than silk. Customers flocked to him, drawn by an inexplicable magnetism. His colleagues watched in stunned silence as he turned rejection into eagerness, hesitation into fervor. Within months, Fred's name was on the lips of every dealership in the state. He shattered sales records with ease, his commissions climbing to dizzying heights. Awards lined his office walls, and his once meager bank account swelled to obscene proportions. But with every success came a subtle, insidious change. His charm grew colder, his smile sharper. He no longer sold cars. He seduced buyers into parting with their money, leaving them dazed and regretful. The dealership thrived, but its customers whispered of a strange, unsettling air about Fred. A predator lurking beneath the veneer of professionalism. The final act of Fred's tale began on a crisp autumn morning. He was tasked with delivering a custom luxury car to a multi-millionaire client, a gleaming machine worth more than most homes. Fred was in high spirits, humming to himself as he guided the car through winding country roads, the leather seats cradling him like a throne. The radio crackled, and the air inside the car seemed to shift, growing heavy. From the corner of his eye, Fred noticed movement. He turned and saw me seated in the passenger seat, my form immaculate and my grin sharper than ever. "Fred," I said, my voice as smooth as the car's engine. "It's time." He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Number not now. Not yet." "A deal's a deal," I reminded him, reaching over to take control of the wheel. The car jerked violently, veering off its path. Fred shouted, his voice cracking with terror, but he was powerless to stop what came next. The vehicle barreled toward a gas station, its polished exterior gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Fred's protests turned to screams as I turned to him, my eyes blazing with infernal fire. "You wanted power, Fred," I said, my tone mocking, "and now you'll have it, a power so great it will consume everything in its path." The car slammed into a gas pump, the impact igniting a massive explosion. Flames roared, consuming metal, asphalt, and flesh alike. The inferno reached skyward, a fitting pyre for the man who had traded his soul for fleeting glory. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained of Fred but charred fragments of metal and a faint, acrid scent of burnt ambition. The news would call it a tragic accident, a cruel twist of fate. But I knew better. And so, another chapter closed, the ink of fate drying on a story that could only end in flames. I departed the scene, the echoes of Fred's screams still ringing in my ears, a symphony of despair that I would carry with me to the next soul in line.